May 1945, the road outside Munich was a river of human misery. It was a river that flowed in both directions, a chaotic shuffling tide of the defeated and the displaced. German soldiers, their uniforms in rags, their faces hollowed out by hunger and shame, trudged east towards homes that no longer existed. And flowing west, against this tide, was another, even more desperate current of humanity, the displaced persons, the DPs, the millions of souls that the war had uprooted and scattered across the continent like chaff in the wind. They were Poles, Ukrainians, Latvians, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, men and women who had been brought to Germany as slave laborers, who had survived the concentration camps, who had been left stranded by the sudden violent collapse of the Third Reich. Standing by the side of this road, a silent, invisible man in a crowd of ghosts, was a man named Arthur. He was not a soldier, not in the traditional sense, he was a bureaucrat. For the past 5 years, he had been a mid-level administrator in the Nazi Party's vast and complex apparatus of control. He was a man of papers, of ledgers, of statistics. He had been a part of the system that had organized the transportation of workers, the distribution of rations, the allocation of housing. He was a man who understood, with the cold analytical precision of a bookkeeper, the brutal mathematics of a nation at war. He had believed, with an almost religious fervor, in the efficiency and the righteousness of that system. Now that system was a smoking ruin. And he, Arthur, was a fugitive. He had shed his party uniform, he had burned his papers, and he was trying to lose himself in the great, anonymous mass of the defeated to make his way back to his family's home in a small, forgotten corner of the countryside. He was a man who had once been a master of order, and he was now adrift in a world of pure elemental chaos. As he watched the endless shuffling columns of the displaced persons, he felt not pity, but a kind of weary, professional contempt. He saw them not as human beings, but as a logistical problem, a problem that was, in his expert opinion, unsolvable. There were millions of them, they were starving, they were sick, and they were, in his view, a subhuman rabble, the dregs of Europe. He knew what would happen to them. They would die of hunger, of disease, of the simple brutal fact that there was no one left to care for them. The German state, the only entity with the organizational genius to manage a problem of this scale, was gone, and the Americans, the clumsy, naive and decadent cowboys who were now the masters of this broken land, they would surely be overwhelmed. They would, he was sure, either let them starve, or in a fit of brutal, pragmatic efficiency, they would herd them into camps and let them die out of sight. He had been taught, and he believed, that the American way of war was a way of brute, overwhelming, and ultimately a wasteful and inefficient force. They had more of everything, yes, but they were a people without a soul, without a sense of order, without the deep mystical understanding of the principles of organization that were the unique genius of the German race. They were a nation of shopkeepers, and they would be no match for a problem of this magnitude. He did not know it yet, but he was about to witness a miracle. He was about to see, with his own eyes, the creation of a system of humanitarian relief that was so vast, so efficient, and so overwhelmingly powerful that it would not just challenge his professional assumptions, it would shatter the very foundations of his entire worldview. He was about to see the Americans build, almost overnight, a series of vast and almost unimaginably complex cities of refuge. He was about to see them feed, house and care for millions of desperate people with a casual, almost thoughtless abundance. He was about to learn that the same industrial and organizational genius that had produced the Sherman tank and the flying fortress could be turned, with an equal and almost terrifying efficiency, to the task of saving lives. He had believed that the Nazi system, with its ruthless Darwinian logic, was the ultimate expression of human organization. He was about to be confronted with a different, and a more powerful, kind of order, an order that was based not on the principle of exclusion, but on the strange, and for him, the incomprehensible, principle of a universal and almost industrial compassion. He had seen his own system create camps of death. He was about to see the Americans create camps of life. And the shock of that discovery would be more profound and more lasting than the shock of any military defeat. To understand the world that had shaped Arthur, one must delve into the strange, almost hermetically sealed world of the National Socialist bureaucracy. It was a world that was, in its own way, as fanatical, as ideological, and as removed from the messy realities of human life as the world of the SS or the Hitler Youth. It was a world of paper, of ink, of the endlessly proliferating and often contradictory regulations that were the lifeblood of the totalitarian state. Arthur was not a product of the beer halls of Munich or the street fights of Berlin. He was a product of the university, a quiet, studious and deeply ambitious young man who had seen in the Nazi Party not a cause for a brawling revolution, but an opportunity for a brilliant and orderly career. He had been drawn to the party's promise of a new and more efficient kind of state, a state that would sweep away the messy, inefficient and decadent chaos of the Weimar democracy and replace it with a new and almost scientifically organized social order. He had studied economics and public administration, and he had become a disciple of the new science of racial hygiene. He had learned to see society not as a collection of individual human beings, but as a single biological organism, the Volkskörper, the people's body, and he had learned that the health of this body depended on its purity. The weak, the sick, the racially inferior, these were not just unfortunate individuals, they were a disease, a cancer, that had to be cut out for the health of the whole. This was not for him a philosophy of hatred, it was a philosophy of science. It was a cold, rational, and deeply modern way of thinking about the world. And it was a philosophy that was perfectly suited to the bureaucratic mindset. It turned the messy, emotional, and often tragic realities of human life into a simple and an almost elegant administrative problem. He had found his place in the vast and ever-expanding bureaucracy of the Reich Labor Front, the organization that was responsible for managing the German workforce. And as the war began, and as the German war machine began to consume the manpower of the nation, his job had taken on a new and a more sinister importance. He was a part of the system that was responsible for the recruitment, the transportation, and the allocation of the millions of foreign workers, the Fremdarbeiter, who were being brought to Germany to keep the factories and the farms running. He was a master of the logistical calculus of human misery. He knew how many calories a Polish farm worker needed to remain productive. He knew the precise amount of living space, measured in cubic meters, that was required to house a Ukrainian factory worker. He knew the most efficient way to transport thousands of French laborers from their homes to the great industrial centers of the Ruhr. He was a man who thought in terms of numbers, of quotas, of a cold, hard and deeply inhuman cost-benefit analysis. He believed, with the quiet professional pride of a man who is good at his job, that the German system of labor management was a masterpiece of efficiency. It was a system that was based on a clear and a scientifically established hierarchy of human worth. The German worker, the Aryan, was at the top. He was to be well fed, well housed, and well cared for. The foreign workers from the Aryan nations of Western Europe, the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, were on the next rung down. They were to be treated with a kind of grudging, professional respect. And at the bottom were the Slavs, the Poles, the Russians, the untermenschen, the subhumans. They were to be treated not as human beings, but as a disposable resource, a form of biological fuel to be consumed by the German war machine. This was the world that Arthur inhabited. It was a world that was orderly, that was rational, and that was in its own monstrous way, completely logical. And it was a world that was, he believed, infinitely superior to the chaotic, inefficient, and racially degenerate world of the Anglo-American democracies. He had a deep and an almost academic contempt for the American system. He had read the books, he had seen the reports, he knew that America was a nation that was crippled by its own sentimental and deeply unscientific belief in the equality of all men. He knew that it was a nation that was torn apart by labor unrest, by racial conflict, by a chaotic and a deeply inefficient form of free market capitalism. He knew that it was a nation that had, in its foolish and sentimental attachment to the principles of democracy, shown itself to be incapable of the kind of ruthless and a scientifically organized social planning that was the great genius of the National Socialist state. And so, as he stood on the side of that dusty road in May of 1945, a fugitive from his own shattered system, he looked at the river of displaced persons, and he saw not a human tragedy, but an administrative problem. And it was a problem that he knew, with the unshakable certainty of a professional, that the Americans were completely and hopelessly ill-equipped to solve. He knew what was required. It was a problem that required a system of a ruthless and a scientifically organized triage. It was a problem that required the separation of the valuable from the valueless, the productive from the unproductive, the racially pure from the racially impure. It was a problem that required a willingness to make the hard and the unsentimental decisions. It was a problem that required, in short, a system that was very much like the one that he had helped to build, and that was now a pile of smoking rubble. The Americans, he was sure, had no such system. They would be overwhelmed by the sheer chaotic and undifferentiated mass of the problem. They would be paralyzed by their own foolish and deeply inefficient humanitarian sentiments. They would try to save everyone, and in doing so, they would save no one. The river of human misery would simply be diverted into a series of vast and an inevitably chaotic and disease-ridden camps where the DPs would be left to rot. It was a grim and a terrible and an almost Malthusian logic. But it was, for Arthur, the only logic that made sense. He did not know it yet, but he was about to be confronted with a different and a more powerful kind of logic. He was about to be confronted with the logic of the American supply chain. He was about to be confronted with the logic of the deuce and a half, of the C ration, of the Quonset hut, of the DDT sprayer. He was about to be confronted with a system that was not based on the principle of exclusion, but on the principle of a vast and an almost unimaginably powerful and efficient inclusion. He had seen his own system create camps of death, camps that were the logical and the inevitable outcome of an ideology of racial purity. He was about to see the Americans create camps of life, camps that were the logical and the inevitable outcome of an ideology of an industrial and a deeply pragmatic humanity. And the shock of that discovery would be more profound and more lasting than the shock of any military defeat. The first, jarring note in Arthur's symphony of cynical expectation came in the form of a simple and a profoundly American object, a sign. As he was shuffling along in the great anonymous mass of humanity, he was suddenly diverted, along with thousands of others, from the main road and onto a smaller secondary track, and at the entrance to this track, there was a sign. It was a simple hand-painted wooden sign, but it was written in a language that was for him a shocking and an almost revolutionary one. It was written not in English, not in German, but in Polish, and below the Polish, it was written in Russian, and below the Russian, it was written in French. It was a sign that said, in the simple universal language of pictures and arrows, Displaced Persons Assembly Center. This was the first small and almost insignificant detail that did not fit Arthur's preconceived narrative. The Americans were not just herding them into a field, they were organizing them, they were communicating with them, they were treating them not as a single, undifferentiated, and subhuman mass, but as a collection of different nationalities, of different peoples, of human beings who had a right to be addressed in their own language. The assembly center itself was a scene of a vast and an almost overwhelming chaos, but it was a chaos that had at its heart a strange and an almost invisible system of order. There were American soldiers everywhere, but they were not the combat infantrymen he had seen before, with their grim, battle-hardened faces. These were different. They were soldiers of the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division, a specialized branch of the military that Arthur had not even known existed. They were older, many of them, and they had the look of professionals, of doctors, of engineers, of city managers, and they were moving through the chaos with a calm and a deeply reassuring sense of a purpose. And they were not alone. They were working with teams of civilians, with representatives of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration UNRRA, with volunteers from the Red Cross, with a whole complex and interlocking ecosystem of organizations that were all dedicated to a single and a seemingly impossible task, to bring order out of this chaos, to bring life out of this ocean of death. The first step in this process was a simple and a profoundly human one: food. Arthur, who was as hungry as any of the other refugees, found himself in a line, moving towards a series of massive olive-drab tents, and from these tents came the smell of a hot meal. It was not a gourmet meal, it was not the feast that the German prisoners of war had been given. It was a simple and a scientifically designed emergency ration. It was a thick and a surprisingly tasty stew made from the canned meat and vegetables of the American C ration. It was served with a piece of the ubiquitous, and for Arthur, the now familiar, soft white American bread. But it was not the food itself that was the shock, it was the scale and the efficiency of its distribution. The American field kitchens were a marvel of industrial design, a complete and a self-contained factory for the production of hot meals, all of it mounted on the back of a 2.5-ton truck. They could produce thousands of meals a day, in the middle of a field, with a speed and a reliability that was to Arthur's trained, bureaucratic eye, a thing of almost terrifying beauty. He had spent his career wrestling with the complex and the often insoluble problems of the German food supply system. He had seen how a single broken-down truck, a single bombed-out railway line, could bring a whole city to the brink of starvation. And here were the Americans, in the middle of a conquered and a devastated country, dispensing hot food to tens of thousands of refugees with the casual and the almost thoughtless efficiency of a big city soup kitchen. The second step in the process was a medical one. After the food, the refugees were directed to another series of tents, the medical receiving stations. And it was here that Arthur, the believer in the science of racial hygiene, was confronted with a different and a more powerful kind of science, the science of public health. The refugees were a walking encyclopedia of the diseases of a collapsed civilization. They were suffering from malnutrition, from dysentery, from typhus, from tuberculosis, and they were all, almost without exception, infested with lice, the tiny and the incredibly dangerous vectors of the deadly typhus fever. Arthur, with his administrator's mind, knew what was required. It was a process of a brutal and an unsentimental triage. The healthy were to be separated from the sick, and the sick, the hopelessly sick, were to be isolated and left to die. It was a grim but a necessary calculation. It was the only way to save the healthy from the contagion of the dying. But that was not what the Americans did. The Americans, with their strange, and their almost insane, belief in the value of every individual human life, had a different solution. It was a solution that was not based on a cold and a Darwinian calculation. It was a solution that was based on a new and a miraculous chemical weapon, DDT. DDT was a powerful and a long-lasting insecticide, and the US Army had it in almost infinite quantities, and they used it with a kind of industrial and almost impersonal thoroughness that was for Arthur a shocking and a deeply unsettling revelation. Every single refugee who passed through the assembly center was subjected to a process of a mass and a compulsory delousing. They were lined up, and an American medic with a hand-pump sprayer would dust them from head to toe with a fine white powder of DDT. It was a swift and a deeply undignified process, but it was also a stunningly effective one. It was a process that was, in a very real sense, saving their lives. It was a process that was stopping a potential typhus epidemic in its tracks. Arthur, who had been taught to see the world in terms of a racial hierarchy, of a struggle between the pure and the impure, was now confronted with a different and a more powerful kind of purity, the purity of a world without lice. It was a simple and a deeply pragmatic form of hygiene, but it was a form of hygiene that was being applied to everyone, without distinction, without prejudice, without a single thought for the racial or the national origin of the person being sprayed. It was a form of a radical and an almost revolutionary equality. It was the equality of the delousee. After the food and the delousing came the third step in the process, registration. This was a process that Arthur, as a bureaucrat, understood. It was a process of creating order out of chaos, of turning an anonymous mass of humanity into a collection of individual and identifiable human beings. But the American system of registration was different from the German one. It was not a system that was designed to separate, to classify, to create a hierarchy of human worth. It was a system that was designed to do one thing, and one thing only, to get these people home. Each refugee was interviewed, with the help of a small army of interpreters. They were asked their name, their nationality, the place of their birth, the last known address of their family, and all of this information was recorded on a series of simple and a brilliantly designed punch cards. These punch cards were the heart of the American system of a human accounting. They were a simple and an incredibly effective form of a pre-digital database, and they were a tool that would allow the American and the UNRRA authorities to begin the monumental task of reuniting the scattered families and of repatriating the millions of displaced persons to their home countries. For Arthur, who had spent his career creating and managing a system of a racial classification, a system that was designed to separate the German from the non-German, the Aryan from the non-Aryan, the master from the slave, this was a profound and a deeply unsettling revelation. He was witnessing a system that was the mirror image of his own. It was a system that was based not on the principle of division, but on the principle of a universal and a deeply human connection. It was a system that was not trying to build a new and a racially pure world order. It was a system that was trying to put a broken and a shattered world back together. And then came the final and the most staggering part of the process, the creation of the displaced persons camps. Arthur, with his cynical and his professionally informed expectations, had assumed that the assembly center was just a temporary and a chaotic way station. He had assumed that the refugees would then be herded into vast and an inevitably squalid and disease-ridden concentration camps, but that was not what happened. The Americans, with their seemingly infinite logistical power, and with the help of their vast and their almost magical corps of engineers, began to build a series of new and a completely self-contained cities, the DP camps. The speed and the scale of this construction was a miracle of a modern industrial engineering. A team of American engineers would arrive at a designated site, a flat, open piece of land near a railway line. They would survey the land, they would lay out a grid of streets, they would bring in their massive bulldozers and earth movers, and they would begin to build. The standard building block of these new cities was a simple and a brilliant invention, the Quonset hut. It was a lightweight and a semicircular structure made of corrugated steel that could be shipped in a flat-packed kit and assembled on site by a small team of men in a matter of a few hours. It was the architectural equivalent of the K-ration, a simple, a standardized, and a stunningly effective solution to a complex logistical problem. And in a matter of a few weeks, a landscape that had been an empty field would be transformed into a city of thousands, a city of neat and of orderly rows of these silver-arched huts. And these were not just empty shells, they were cities with a complete and a functioning infrastructure. The engineers would lay down water pipes, they would dig sewer lines, they would string electrical wires, they would build not just barracks, but kitchens, and mess halls, and hospitals, and schools, and churches, and workshops. Arthur, who was eventually assigned to a position as a German administrator in one of these camps, the Great DP Camp at Mannheim, had a front row seat at this spectacle of a creation, and he could only watch in a state of a stunned and a professional awe. He had spent his career in a system that was, he had believed, the pinnacle of a human organization, and he was now witnessing a system that was so far beyond the capabilities of his own that it seemed to belong to a different and a more advanced species. He would watch as a train would arrive, a train that was not filled with the human wreckage of the war, but with the raw materials of a new civilization, a train that was filled with lumber, with cement, with electrical wire, with plumbing fixtures, with all the myriad and the mundane components of a modern city. And he would watch as the American engineers and their German work crews would take these components and with a speed and an efficiency that was almost magical, would turn them into a functioning and a livable community. But it was not just the physical infrastructure of the camps that was the miracle, it was the social and the political infrastructure. The Americans, with their strange and their almost dogmatic belief in the principles of a self-government, did not run the camps as military dictatorships, they ran them as a kind of a supervised and a temporary democracy. Each camp had its own elected council of residents, its own internal police force, its own judicial system. Each camp had its own and a vibrant cultural life. There were theater groups and orchestras and newspapers and sports teams. The Americans provided the raw materials, the food, the shelter, the security, but they left it to the DPs themselves to create a community, to create a life, to create a new and a temporary home. For Arthur, who had been a part of a system that was based on the principle of a total and a top-down control, this was the most radical and the most incomprehensible thing of all. He had been taught that the masses, particularly the inferior masses of the Slavic peoples, were incapable of a self-government. He had been taught that they needed the firm and the guiding hand of a master, and here were the Americans, who were treating these subhumans as if they were rational and responsible and are capable of managing their own affairs. It was a gamble, an experiment that seemed to him to be doomed to a failure, but it was an experiment that was, for the most part, a stunning success. The DP camps were not a utopia, they were crowded, they were filled with the trauma and the grief of the war, and they were often plagued by the same ancient and intractable ethnic and political conflicts that had torn Europe apart. But they were not the chaotic and the disease-ridden hellholes that Arthur had predicted. They were functioning and a surprisingly vibrant and hopeful communities. They were places where a people who had been stripped of everything were beginning, slowly and painfully, to rebuild their lives and to rediscover their humanity, and it was in the heart of this strange and this unexpected new world that Arthur began his own, personal, and a deeply painful process of a re-education. He was a man who had been a master of a system of a death. He was now a student in a system of a life. And the lessons he learned were not the lessons of the lecture hall or the textbook, they were the lessons of a daily and a direct confrontation with a reality that was so completely and so profoundly at odds with the world he had known. He would sit in his small and his sparsely furnished office in the camp's administrative building, and he would work with the American and the UNRRA officials, and he would be in a constant and a low-grade state of a professional shock. He would see the logistical requests, the orders for the tons of flour, for the thousands of blankets, for the miles of a medical gauze, and he would see the supply trucks, the endless and the inexhaustible river of a material that would arrive day after day to fulfill those requests. He had been a part of a system that was in a constant and a desperate state of a shortage. He had spent his career writing and reading memos about the need for a conservation, for an austerity, for a sacrifice, and he was now a part of a system of a surplus, a system where the primary administrative challenge was not the acquisition of resources, but their efficient and their equitable distribution. But the most profound lessons were not in the logistics, they were in the philosophy, in the underlying and the often unspoken assumptions of the American system. He would sit in the meetings with the American officers, and he would be stunned by their strange and their almost childlike belief in the possibility of a progress, of a solution, of a happy ending. They were faced with a human catastrophe of a biblical proportion, and they were attacking it with a kind of an optimistic and a can-do and a deeply pragmatic spirit that was a world away from the grim and the fatalistic and the often cynical realism of the European mind. They were not warriors in the German sense, they were not philosophers, they were engineers, they were problem solvers, and the problem they were trying to solve was the problem of a human suffering, and they were solving it with the same and a systematic and an almost impersonal efficiency that they had used to build their tanks and their bombers and their atomic bombs. For Arthur, who had been raised in a culture that glorified the tragic and the heroic and the almost mystical beauty of a glorious death, this American obsession with the simple and the mundane and the deeply practical business of keeping people alive was a profound and a deeply unsettling revelation. He had been taught to believe that the ultimate expression of a nation's greatness was in its ability to wage a war. He was now beginning to suspect that it was in its ability to build a refugee camp, and it was in the quiet and the lonely hours of the night, in his small and his Spartan room, that Arthur would grapple with the full and the terrible implications of this discovery. He would lie on his cot, and he would listen to the sounds of the camp, the distant and the muffled sounds of a city of 500,000 souls, a city that was alive, a city that was against all odds, a city of a hope, and he would think of the other camps, the camps that he had been a part of, the camps that were the dark and the secret and the logical heart of the system he had served. He would think of the camps that had been built not to save lives, but to extinguish them. He would think of the cold and the scientific and the deeply rational efficiency of the gas chambers and the crematoria, and he would be consumed by a sense of a shame and a horror that was so profound that it was almost a physical illness. He had been a part of a system that had used the very tools of a modernity, of a bureaucracy, of a science, to create the greatest and the most monstrous crime in human history, and he had been defeated by a system that was using those same tools to create the greatest and the most ambitious act of a humanitarian rescue in human history. He had believed that he was a servant of a higher and a more efficient form of a reason. He now knew that he had been a servant of a mad and a murderous and a deeply irrational ideology. He had believed that he was a part of a system that was building a new and a better world. He now knew that he had been a part of a system that had almost destroyed it. The Americans had done what the Nazis never could. They had not just won a war, they had won the argument. They had won the argument about the meaning of a modernity, about the purpose of a power, about the ultimate and the enduring value of a single and an individual and a deeply precious human life. And they had won that argument not in the lecture halls of a university, but in the mud and the chaos and the quiet and the heroic and the deeply human reality of a displaced persons camp in the heart of a defeated and a broken and a slowly and a painfully regenerating Germany. The daily reality of administering the Mannheim camp was for Arthur a relentless graduate-level seminar in the American way of war, a war that did not end when the shooting stopped. He, who had once managed the cold equations of forced labor, now found himself managing the complex, chaotic and deeply human logistics of a city of the uprooted. His old skills, his understanding of transport, of housing, of resource allocation were still relevant, but the philosophy behind their application was a complete and shocking inversion of everything he had ever known. In the Nazi system, the camp was an instrument of control, a tool for the subjugation and ultimately the elimination of undesirable populations. The logic was one of subtraction, of purification, of a relentless and scientific winnowing of the human herd. Here, in the American system, the camp was an instrument of restoration. The logic was one of addition, of stabilization, of a pragmatic and deeply unsentimental effort to preserve and to restore the very human capital that his own system had been so eager to destroy. He would sit in on the daily planning meetings with the American military government officers and the UNRRA team, and he would be in a constant state of a low-grade, professional amazement. The meetings were not the formal, hierarchical affairs of a German staff meeting where orders were given from the top down and dissent was a form of treason. They were a kind of a controlled and a surprisingly creative chaos. They were a brainstorming session, a workshop, a town hall meeting. An American major, a man who had been a city manager in Ohio before the war, would stand in front of a map and say, "Okay people, we have a problem. The new transport of Polish DPs has brought in 500 cases of typhus. The hospital is full. What are we going to do?" And what followed was not a series of pronouncements, but a discussion. A medical officer would talk about the need for a new quarantine ward. An engineer would talk about the time it would take to build it. A supply officer would talk about the availability of cots, of blankets, of medical supplies. And a UNRRA social worker, a woman of a formidable and a deeply compassionate intelligence, would talk about the need to manage the fear and the panic among the camp population. It was a process of a collaborative and a deeply pragmatic problem-solving. It was a process that was messy, that was inefficient, that was often frustrating, but it was a process that, to Arthur's astonishment, worked. He saw the American system not as a perfect and a monolithic machine, but as a living and an adaptive organism. It was a system that was constantly making mistakes, that was constantly being surprised, that was constantly having to improvise, but it was also a system that was constantly learning, that was constantly correcting itself, that was constantly getting better. He saw this in the evolution of the food program. The initial emergency rations of C-ration stew and white bread had kept the refugees alive, but the American nutritionists and the UNRRA officials knew that it was not a sustainable or a healthy long-term solution, and so they began a massive and a complex effort to create a food supply system that was not just adequate but was culturally appropriate. They knew that a Pole's idea of a good meal was different from an Italian's, which was different from a Ukrainian's, and they began to source and to distribute the ingredients that would allow the DPs to cook their own traditional foods. The camp kitchens, which had been run as centralized American-style mess halls, were slowly transformed into a series of smaller and more communal kitchens, where the women of the camp could cook the stews, the soups, the breads of their homelands. It was a logistical nightmare, but it was a nightmare that the Americans, with their vast resources and their strange and their almost anthropological curiosity, were willing to embrace. He saw this in the evolution of the housing program. The initial emergency shelter of the tents and the Quonset huts had been a brilliant, short-term solution. But as the months wore on and it became clear that the DP problem was not going to be solved overnight, the Americans began a program of a winterization, of an improvement, of a humanization of the camps. They brought in lumber and insulation and stoves, and they encouraged and they empowered the DPs themselves to improve their own living quarters, to build partitions, to plant gardens, to turn the anonymous and the industrial spaces of the camp into a semblance of a home. He saw this in the evolution of the education and the employment programs. The initial and the primary goal was to keep the DPs busy, to keep them from sinking into the apathy and the despair that is the great enemy of a refugee's soul. But as the camps became more established, the programs became more ambitious. The Americans and the UNRRA established vocational training schools where the DPs could learn a new trade, a skill that would be useful in the rebuilding of their shattered countries. They established schools for the children, schools that were staffed by the teachers and the intellectuals among the DP population. They were not just trying to keep these people alive, they were trying to give them a future. And it was in the heart of this strange and this unexpected new world of a pragmatic and an industrial and a deeply humanistic nation building that Arthur began his own, personal, and a deeply painful process of a deconstruction and a reconstruction. He was a man who had been a master of a system that had been based on the principle of a purity, of an exclusion, of a death. He was now a cog in a machine that was based on the principle of a diversity, of an inclusion, of a life. He would walk through the camp in the evenings, and he would be in a constant and a low-grade state of a philosophical shock. He would hear in the space of a single 100-yard walk a dozen different languages. He would see a dozen different national flags hanging from the doorways of the Quonset huts. He would see a Polish Catholic priest walking and talking with a Ukrainian Orthodox patriarch. He would see a group of Jewish survivors, the skeletal and the haunted-eyed remnants of the death camps, gathered together for a makeshift and a deeply poignant Sabbath service. This was the world that his own system had tried to destroy. This was the messy and the vibrant and the deeply human diversity that the Nazi ideology, with its sterile and its murderous and its deeply insane obsession with a racial purity, had tried to erase from the face of the earth. And here it was, in a camp that was being run by the Americans, not just surviving, but in a strange and a chaotic and a deeply beautiful way, thriving. And he would be consumed by a sense of a shame and a horror that was so profound that it was almost a physical illness. He had been a part of a system that had used the very tools of a modernity, of a bureaucracy, of a science, to create the greatest and the most monstrous crime in human history. And he had been defeated by a system that was using those same tools to create the greatest and the most ambitious act of a humanitarian rescue in human history. He had believed that he was a servant of a higher and a more efficient form of a reason. He now knew that he had been a servant of a mad and a murderous and a deeply irrational ideology. He had believed that he was a part of a system that was building a new and a better world. He now knew that he had been a part of a system that had almost destroyed it. The Americans had done what the Nazis never could. They had not just won a war, they had won the argument. They had won the argument about the meaning of a modernity, about the purpose of a power, about the ultimate and the enduring value of a single and an individual and a deeply precious human life. And they had won that argument not in the lecture halls of a university, but in the mud and the chaos and the quiet and the heroic and the deeply human reality of a displaced persons camp in the heart of a defeated and a broken and a slowly and a painfully regenerating Germany. The daily reality of administering the Mannheim camp was, for Arthur, a relentless graduate-level seminar in the American way of war, a war that did not end when the shooting stopped. He, who had once managed the cold equations of forced labor, now found himself managing the complex, chaotic, and deeply human logistics of a city of the uprooted. His old skills, his understanding of transport, of housing, of resource allocation, were still relevant, but the philosophy behind their application was a complete and shocking inversion of everything he had ever known. In the Nazi system, the camp was an instrument of control, a tool for the subjugation and ultimately the elimination of undesirable populations. The logic was one of subtraction, of purification, of a relentless and scientific winnowing of the human herd. Here, in the American system, the camp was an instrument of restoration. The logic was one of addition, of stabilization, of a pragmatic and deeply unsentimental effort to preserve and to restore the very human capital that his own system had been so eager to destroy. He would sit in on the daily planning meetings with the American military government officers and the UNRRA team, and he would be in a constant state of a low-grade professional amazement. The meetings were not the formal, hierarchical affairs of a German staff meeting where orders were given from the top down and dissent was a form of treason. They were a kind of a controlled and a surprisingly creative chaos. They were a brainstorming session, a workshop, a town hall meeting. An American major, a man who had been a city manager in Ohio before the war, would stand in front of a map and say, "Okay people, we have a problem. The new transport of Polish DPs has brought in 500 cases of typhus. The hospital is full. What are we going to do?" And what followed was not a series of pronouncements, but a discussion. A medical officer would talk about the need for a new quarantine ward, an engineer would talk about the time it would take to build it, a supply officer would talk about the availability of cots, of blankets, of medical supplies, and a UNRRA social worker, a woman of a formidable and a deeply compassionate intelligence, would talk about the need to manage the fear and the panic among the camp population. It was a process of a collaborative and a deeply pragmatic problem solving. It was a process that was messy, that was inefficient, that was often frustrating, but it was a process that, to Arthur's astonishment, worked. He saw the American system not as a perfect and a monolithic machine, but as a living and an adaptive organism. It was a system that was constantly making mistakes, that was constantly being surprised, that was constantly having to improvise, but it was also a system that was constantly learning, that was constantly correcting itself, that was constantly getting better. He saw this in the evolution of the food program. The initial emergency rations of C-ration stew and white bread had kept the refugees alive, but the American nutritionists and the UNRRA officials knew that it was not a sustainable or a healthy long-term solution, and so they began a massive and a complex effort to create a food supply system that was not just adequate, but was culturally appropriate. They knew that a Pole's idea of a good meal was different from an Italian's, which was different from a Ukrainian's, and they began to source and to distribute the ingredients that would allow the DPs to cook their own traditional foods. The camp kitchens, which had been run as centralized American-style mess halls, were slowly transformed into a series of smaller and more communal kitchens, where the women of the camp could cook the stews, the soups, the breads of their homelands. It was a logistical nightmare, but it was a nightmare that the Americans, with their vast resources and their strange and their almost anthropological curiosity, were willing to embrace. He saw this in the evolution of the housing program. The initial emergency shelter of the tents and the Quonset huts had been a brilliant, short-term solution, but as the months wore on and it became clear that the DP problem was not going to be solved overnight, the Americans began a program of a winterization, of an improvement, of a humanization of the camps. They brought in lumber and insulation and stoves, and they encouraged and they empowered the DPs themselves to improve their own living quarters, to build partitions, to plant gardens, to turn the anonymous and the industrial spaces of the camp into a semblance of a home. He saw this in the evolution of the education and the employment programs. The initial and the primary goal was to keep the DPs busy, to keep them from sinking into the apathy and the despair that is the great enemy of a refugee's soul. But as the camps became more established, the programs became more ambitious. The Americans and the UNRRA established vocational training schools where the DPs could learn a new trade, a skill that would be useful in the rebuilding of their shattered countries. They established schools for the children, schools that were staffed by the teachers and the intellectuals among the DP population. They were not just trying to keep these people alive, they were trying to give them a future, and it was in the heart of this strange and this unexpected new world of a pragmatic and an industrial and a deeply humanistic nation building that Arthur began his own personal and a deeply painful process of a deconstruction and a reconstruction. He was a man who had been a master of a system that had been based on the principle of a purity, of an exclusion, of a death. He was now a cog in a machine that was based on the principle of a diversity, of an inclusion, of a life. He would walk through the camp in the evenings, and he would be in a constant and a low-grade state of a philosophical shock. He would hear, in the space of a single 100-yard walk, a dozen different languages. He would see a dozen different national flags hanging from the doorways of the Quonset huts. He would see a Polish Catholic priest walking and talking with a Ukrainian Orthodox patriarch. He would see a group of Jewish survivors, the skeletal and the haunted-eyed remnants of the death camps, gathered together for a makeshift and a deeply poignant Sabbath service. This was the world that his own system had tried to destroy. This was the messy and the vibrant and the deeply human diversity that the Nazi ideology, with its sterile and its murderous and its deeply insane obsession with a racial purity, had tried to erase from the face of the earth. And here it was, in a camp that was being run by the Americans, not just surviving, but in a strange and a chaotic and a deeply beautiful way, thriving. And he would be consumed by a sense of a shame and a horror that was so profound that it was almost a physical illness. He had been a part of a system that had used the very tools of a modernity, of a bureaucracy, of a science, to create the greatest and the most monstrous crime in human history. And he had been defeated by a system that was using those same tools to create the greatest and the most ambitious act of a humanitarian rescue in human history. He had believed that he was a servant of a higher and a more efficient form of a reason. He now knew that he had been a servant of a mad and a murderous and a deeply irrational ideology. He had believed that he was a part of a system that was building a new and a better world. He now knew that he had been a part of a system that had almost destroyed it. The Americans had done what the Nazis never could. They had not just won a war, they had won the argument. They had won the argument about the meaning of a modernity, about the purpose of a power, about the ultimate and the enduring value of a single and an individual and a deeply precious human life. And they had won that argument not in the lecture halls of a university, but in the mud and the chaos and the quiet and the heroic and the deeply human reality of a displaced persons camp, in the heart of a defeated and a broken and a slowly and a painfully regenerating Germany. Arthur's new life within the administrative heart of the Mannheim displaced persons camp was a journey into the engine room of a machine he had fundamentally misunderstood. He, a man who had prided himself on his mastery of systems, of ledgers, of the cold, hard arithmetic of human resource management, was now a student in a school of logistics so advanced and so alien to his own experience that it felt like a form of magic. His office was a small partitioned corner of a Quonset hut, a space he shared with a perpetually harried American captain from the military government and a fiercely idealistic young woman from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA. The air was a constant churn of American cigarette smoke, the clatter of typewriters, and a bewildering polyglot of languages as petitioners and translators moved in and out in a steady, chaotic stream. His initial role was a simple one, born of the Americans' pragmatic need for German-speaking administrators who understood the ruined landscape of their own country. He was tasked with helping to organize the tracing bureau. It was a seemingly mundane job, a task of paperwork and cross-referencing, but it was, in its essence, the most profound and revolutionary work he had ever done. The Tracing Bureau was the camp's central nervous system for memory and identity. Its sole purpose was to answer the single, agonizing question that haunted every soul in this city of the lost: is my family alive? In the system Arthur had served, paperwork was a weapon of division and destruction. It was the science of racial classification, of property confiscation, of transportation to the camps in the East. A person's identity, as recorded on a government form, was their sentence. Here, in this chaotic American hut, paperwork was being turned into a tool of resurrection. The system was a marvel of low-tech, brute force ingenuity. Every new arrival to the camp was interviewed, and every scrap of information, a name, a birth date, a village, the last known location of a spouse or a child, was recorded on an index card. These cards, hundreds of thousands of them, became a vast paper-based search engine, a database of sorrow and of hope. Arthur's job was to help manage this database. He would sit for hours, his fingers stained with ink, sorting through the cards, looking for matches, for connections, for the faint statistical echo of a family that had been torn apart by the war. And when a match was found, when a card from Mannheim connected with a card from a similar tracing bureau in another camp in another zone of occupation, the effect was like a small localized miracle. He would watch as the UNRRA social worker, the young idealistic woman with whom he shared his office, would go out into the camp to deliver the news. He would see her find a Polish woman who had believed her husband to be dead and tell her that he was alive, that he was in a camp near Stuttgart. He would witness the moment of disbelief, the dawning of an impossible hope, the explosion of a joy so profound and so pure that it was almost painful to watch. He, Arthur, a man who had spent his career managing the logistics of human despair, was now a bookkeeper for miracles, and every miracle was a small sharp stab in the heart of his old worldview. His system had been designed to erase identities, to turn human beings into anonymous, interchangeable units of labor. The American system, in its clumsy, chaotic and almost sentimental way, was obsessed with the individual. It was a system that was willing to expend enormous resources of time, of manpower, of gasoline, to find a single lost person, to restore a single broken family. It was a logic that was so completely and utterly alien to the cold, Darwinian calculus of his own training that it left him in a state of a constant, low-grade philosophical shock. He saw the same logic at work in the camp hospital. The hospital was a city in itself, a sprawling complex of tents and huts, staffed by American Army doctors and nurses, and by the many doctors and nurses who were themselves displaced persons. Arthur, in his administrative capacity, had to review the hospital's supply requisitions, and the numbers he saw were staggering. He saw orders for thousands of units of blood plasma, for hundreds of thousands of doses of penicillin, for miles of sterile gauze. He saw requests for complex surgical equipment, for X-ray machines, for orthopedic devices. He had been trained in a system where medical resources were a strategic commodity, to be allocated according to a strict and a ruthless hierarchy of value. A wounded German soldier, a productive factory worker, these were men whose lives were worth the expenditure of precious medical supplies. A sick slave laborer, an elderly, unproductive woman, a racially undesirable child, these were lives that were, in the cold calculus of his old world, a liability, a drain on the resources of the state. But the Americans, with their strange and almost insane disregard for this kind of rational calculation, had a different philosophy. Their philosophy was simple: if a life could be saved, it should be saved. He saw the American doctors performing complex, life-saving surgery on Jewish survivors of the concentration camps, men and women who were little more than walking skeletons, who by any sane, economic definition, had no value at all. He saw them setting up specialized pediatric clinics to care for the hundreds of orphaned children who were roaming the ruins of Germany, children who were a logistical burden, a drain on the food supply. He saw them expending a fortune in gasoline and manpower to transport a single, critically ill patient from a remote, rural camp to a specialized hospital in a larger city. It was a form of madness. It was a form of a logistical and an economic insanity. But it was a madness that was, in its own way, a demonstration of a power so profound that it left him speechless. It was the power of a nation that was so rich, so confident, so overwhelmingly powerful that it could afford to be compassionate. It could afford to treat every individual human life as a thing of an almost infinite value. It was a luxury that his own, perpetually struggling and resource-poor Reich had never been able to afford. The most jarring, and for Arthur, the most personally challenging, aspect of this new world was the role of the displaced persons themselves. In his old system, the inferior peoples, the Slavs, the Poles, the residents of the occupied territories, were seen as a passive and a largely inert mass, a resource to be managed, to be exploited, to be controlled. They were the objects of history, not the subjects. But the Americans, with their strange and almost dogmatic belief in the principles of self-government, had a different approach. They did not run the DP camps as military dictatorships. They ran them as a kind of a supervised and a temporary democracy. Each camp had its own elected council of residents. It had its own internal police force, staffed by the DPs themselves. It had its own judicial system, with courts and judges chosen from among the refugee population. It was a system that was based on a radical, and for Arthur, a deeply unsettling premise, the premise that these people, these subhumans, were capable of managing their own affairs. He would watch, from the detached, professional perspective of his administrative office, as this grand, and in his view, this hopelessly naive, experiment unfolded. He saw the chaos, the squabbling, the endless, and often, bitter political infighting between the different national and political factions within the camp. He saw the corruption, the black markets, the struggle for power, and he felt a sense of a grim and a cynical satisfaction. This, he thought, is what happens when you treat children as adults. This is the inevitable result of the foolish American belief in democracy. But he also saw something else. He saw a community that was, against all odds, beginning to form. He saw the camp's elected leaders, men and women who had been through the hell of the war, grappling, with a surprising and an often inspiring seriousness, with the complex problems of their new and a temporary city. He saw the camp's police force, armed with nothing but armbands and the authority of their own community, managing to maintain a semblance of order in a city of 500,000 traumatized and desperate souls. He saw the camp's schools, its workshops, its cultural institutions, all of it run by the DPs themselves, all of it a testament to a spirit of a resilience, of a creativity, and of a deep human need for a community that he had been taught to believe did not exist. And it was in the camp's cultural life that this spirit found its most vibrant, and for Arthur, its most disorienting expression. The camp was not a silent and a somber place of a morning. It was a noisy and a chaotic and a surprisingly joyful place. It was a place that was filled with music, with theater, with art. The DPs, with the encouragement of the UNRRA and the American authorities, had formed their own orchestras, their own choirs, their own theater troupes. He would walk through the camp in the evenings, and he would hear the sound of a Polish folk song, the mournful and a beautiful melody of a Ukrainian ballad, the defiant and a hopeful strains of a Jewish hymn. He would see a makeshift theater, a stage built from salvaged lumber in a Quonset hut, where a group of Lithuanian actors were performing a play by Chekhov. He would see an art exhibition, a series of charcoal drawings and watercolors that had been created by the artists of the camp, images of a startling and a heartbreaking beauty, images of the world they had lost, and of the new and a strange world they were now inhabiting. This was the culture, the life, the spirit that his own supposedly superior culture had tried to extinguish, and here it was, in a refugee camp in the heart of a defeated Germany, not just surviving, but being reborn, being nurtured, being celebrated, and it was being celebrated under the protection of the very army that he had been taught to believe was the ultimate expression of a soulless and a cultureless materialism. The contradictions were becoming too great to bear. The world was no longer making sense. The simple and the brutal and the deeply rational certainties of his Nazi worldview were dissolving, leaving him in a state of a profound and a terrifying philosophical vertigo. He began to spend more time in the camp's library. It was his refuge, the one place where the chaos of the present could be held at bay by the quiet and the orderly world of the past. The library was a project of the American Information Control Division, a branch of the military government that was tasked with the re-education of the German people, and it was stocked with the books that had been banned and burned by the regime he had served. He began to read. He read with the desperate and the almost insatiable hunger of a man who has been starved of the truth. He read the novels of Thomas Mann, of Erich Maria Remarque, of Stefan Zweig, the great and the humane, and the deeply civilized voices of the Germany that had been silenced. He read the works of the American authors, of Hemingway, of Faulkner, of Sinclair Lewis, and he discovered a literature that was not a tool of the state, but a fierce and an often critical examination of the society that had produced it. He read the history books, the books that told a different and a more complex and a more truthful story of the world than the simple and the mythical and the deeply dishonest narrative he had been taught in the schools of the Third Reich. He was a man who was, in a very real sense, being deprogrammed and reprogrammed. He was shedding the skin of the Nazi bureaucrat and growing the new and the painful and the deeply uncertain skin of a democrat. And it was a process that was filled with a guilt, with a confusion, and with a deep and an abiding sense of a loss. He was losing his country, his identity, the entire framework of meaning that had given his life its purpose, and he was replacing it with the culture of his enemy, a culture that he was still not sure he fully understood or trusted, and it was in the midst of this profound and this personal crisis that he had his most and a deeply transformative encounter. He was working late one night in his office, wrestling with a particularly complex set of logistical charts, when the American major, the former city manager from Ohio, came in. The major, whose name was Henderson, was a man whom Arthur had come to respect, in a grudging and a professional way. He was not a brilliant man, not an intellectual in the German sense, but he was a man of a deep and a practical and an almost unshakable competence. He was a man who knew how to get things done. Henderson sat down on the edge of Arthur's desk, a look of a weary and a good-natured frustration on his face. "Arthur," he said, "we have a problem." The problem was a simple and a seemingly intractable one. A dispute had broken out between the Polish and the Ukrainian councils in the camp over the allocation of a new shipment of blankets. It was a small and a petty and a deeply human dispute, a dispute that was rooted in centuries of a mutual and a bitter and a complex history. Arthur, with his old and his cynical and his deeply German mindset, knew what was required. It was a problem that required an exercise of an authority. The American commander should simply issue an order and the dispute would be resolved, but that was not what Henderson proposed. "I want you to talk to them," he said. "You're a German. They don't trust us, but they might trust you. I want you to sit down with them, to listen to their grievances, to try to work out a compromise." Arthur was stunned. "Me?" he said. "I am a German. They hate us more than they hate each other." Henderson smiled, a slow and a weary and a deeply American smile. "Maybe," he said, "but you're also the man who knows how to get things done. You're a part of the system now, and in our system, we don't solve problems by giving orders, we solve them by talking." And so, the next day, Arthur, the former Nazi bureaucrat, the man who had been trained to see the world in terms of a command and an obedience, found himself in a room with a group of angry and a grieving and a deeply suspicious Polish and Ukrainian refugees. And he did what he had been told to do. He listened. He listened for hours. He listened to their stories of the war, of the occupation, of the brutal and the often fratricidal violence that had torn their homelands apart. He listened to their fears for the future, to their desperate and their often contradictory hopes for a new and a better world, and as he listened, a strange and a wonderful and a deeply transformative thing began to happen. He began to see them not as a logistical problem, not as a collection of statistical data, not as representatives of an inferior race. He began to see them as human beings. He began to see the world through their eyes. He began to feel a sense of an empathy, of a connection, of a shared and a universal and a deeply human suffering. He did not solve their problem, not in that one meeting, but he began a process, he began a conversation, and in doing so, he began to discover a new and a different and a more powerful kind of an order. It was not the order of the command, of the hierarchy, of the state. It was the order of the community, of the consensus, of the simple and the difficult and the deeply human process of a talking and of a listening and of a finding a common ground. It was the order of a democracy, and it was an order that was, he was beginning to suspect, more powerful and more resilient and more enduring than the simple and the brutal and the ultimately self-destructive order of the gun. He had believed that the Nazi system, with its ruthless and its scientific and its deeply rational efficiency, was the pinnacle of a human organization. He now knew that it was a system that was, in its very essence, a form of a madness, a form of a deep and a profound and a ultimately suicidal irrationality. It was a system that had tried to solve the complex and the messy and the deeply human problems of the world by a simple and a brutal and a deeply inhuman act of a subtraction, and he had been defeated by a system that was based on a different and a more complex and a more difficult and a more human principle. It was a system that was based on the principle of an addition. It was a system that was messy, that was chaotic, that was often inefficient, but it was a system that was, in the end, a system of a life. He had seen his own system create camps of a death, he had seen the Americans create camps of a life, and he had in the most direct and the most personal and the most transformative way been a part of that creation, and it was an experience that would change him and his world forever. The Americans had done what the Nazis never could. They had not just won a war, they had in the heart of a defeated and a broken and a deeply cynical Europe managed to build a city of a hope, and in doing so, they had given him and the millions of other souls who had been shipwrecked by the war a reason to believe in the possibility of a new and a better world. The evolution of the displaced persons camps from chaotic emergency shelters into semi-permanent, self-governing cities was a process that was as messy, as complex, and as fraught with a conflict as the continent on which they were built. For Arthur, who was now a key if a deeply ambivalent part of the camp administration, it was a daily and a relentless education in the American genius for a pragmatic and an often improvised problem-solving. It was a genius that was, he was beginning to understand, a world away from the rigid and the top-down and the often brittle perfectionism of the German administrative mind. The problem of the camp's economy was a perfect example. The initial system, where the Americans and the UNRRA simply provided everything, the food, the clothing, the shelter, was a necessary, short-term solution. But it was a solution that created a new and a more insidious kind of a problem, the problem of a dependency, of an apathy, of a deep and a corrosive and a soul-destroying boredom. The DPs were being kept alive, but they were not living. They were a people in a state of a suspended animation, a people without a purpose. Arthur, with his old and his Nazi and his deeply ingrained way of thinking, knew what the German solution would have been. It would have been a system of a forced labor, of a rigid and a military-style organization, of a turning the camp into a productive and an economic unit for the benefit of the state. The DPs would have been given a purpose, yes, but it would have been the purpose of a slave. But the Americans, with their strange and their almost dogmatic belief in the principles of a free enterprise, had a different idea. Their idea was to create a market. It was a radical and a seemingly chaotic and an inefficient solution, but it was a solution that was, in its own way, a stroke of a genius. They began by paying the DPs for the work they did, not just the work they did for the American administration, but the work they did for their own community. The teachers, the doctors, the policemen, the members of the camp council, all of them were given a small, but a regular wage, paid in a special camp-issued currency, the DP mark. And they established a camp store, a PX, where this new money could be spent. The PX was not a simple and a utilitarian distribution center, it was a real and a surprisingly well-stocked store. It sold the surplus and the often luxurious goods of the American consumer economy, cigarettes and candy and soap and razor blades and Coca-Cola, and it was a store that was run not by the American army, but by the DPs themselves as a cooperative enterprise. The effect was instantaneous and it was transformative. The camp, which had been a place of a passive and a sullen and a dependent waiting, was suddenly electrified by the jolt of a free market capitalism. The DP marks became a real and a valuable currency, and the DPs themselves, who had been the passive recipients of a charity, were suddenly transformed into entrepreneurs. A black market, of course, immediately sprang up. A cigarette became the unofficial currency of the camp, a unit of a value that was more stable and more trusted than any paper money. But it was a black market that was, for the most part, a creative and a productive and a surprisingly non-violent one. It was a market of a skill, of a craft, of an ingenuity. A man who was a tailor in the old country would set up a small business, repairing the threadbare clothes of his fellow DPs in exchange for a few cigarettes. A woman who was a good cook would use her extra rations to bake a cake, which she would sell, slice by slice, for a small and a delicious profit. A man who was a skilled woodworker would build a beautiful and an intricately carved chess set, which he would trade for a week's worth of a coffee. The camp, in a matter of a few short months, was transformed. It was no longer just a collection of a barracks and a mess halls. It was a bustling and a vibrant and a surprisingly complex city, with its own and a thriving and a completely unregulated economy. It was a city with its own and a restaurants and a cafes and a workshops and a theatres. It was a city with its own and a rich and a poor and a striving and a deeply human middle class. For Arthur, who had been trained in the principles of a state-controlled and a centrally planned and a rational economy, this was a vision of a pure and an unadulterated chaos. It was inefficient, it was unfair, it was by any German standard a complete and an utter administrative mess. And yet, he could not deny that it was working. It was working in a way that his own and a much more orderly and a much more rational system had never worked. He saw that the camp was not just producing goods and services, it was producing a hope. It was giving the DPs a sense of an agency, of a control over their own lives, of a purpose. It was, in a very real and a very powerful way, giving them back their dignity. And he saw that the Americans, for the most part, simply let it happen. They did not try to control it, to regulate it, to stamp it out. They seemed to understand, with a kind of an instinctive and a deeply cultural wisdom, that this chaotic and this messy and this often infuriating process of a free enterprise was a more powerful and a more effective form of a social organization than any top-down and a bureaucratic and a state-controlled system could ever be. It was a lesson in the power of a freedom, a lesson that was being taught not in a classroom but in the bustling and the vibrant and the deeply human marketplace of a refugee camp. And it was a lesson that was, for Arthur, a profound and a deeply and a personally transformative one. He had been a man who had believed in the power of a plan. He was now beginning to understand the power of a mess. The problem of a justice in the camps was another, and an even more complex and a more difficult challenge. The DP camps were a city of victims, but they were also a city of perpetrators. They were filled not just with the survivors of the Nazi terror, but with the collaborators, the informers, the low-level functionaries of the Nazi machine. And they were filled with the ancient and the bitter and the often violent hatreds of a war-torn Europe, the hatred of the Pole for the Ukrainian, of the Lithuanian for the Russian, of almost everyone for the German. Arthur, with his old and his cynical and his deeply German mindset, knew what the traditional solution to this problem was. It was the solution of a force, of a repression, of a swift and a brutal and an often arbitrary justice. It was the solution of the midnight knock on the door, of the summary execution, of the concentration camp. But the Americans, once again, had a different and a more radical idea. Their idea was to create a system of a law. It was an idea that was, in the context of a post-war Germany, an idea of an almost utopian audacity. They established a system of a DP courts that were staffed not by American military judges, but by the DPs themselves. Each court had a panel of judges, a prosecutor, and a defense attorney, all of them chosen from among the refugee population, and in these makeshift courts, in the spare and the unadorned rooms of the camp's administrative buildings, a strange and a wonderful and a deeply human drama began to unfold. The DPs, a people who had been the victims of a system of a lawlessness, were now being asked to become the agents of a law. They were being asked to grapple with the complex and the often intractable problems of a justice, of a guilt, of a responsibility. Arthur, in his administrative capacity, was often asked to sit in on these courts, as an observer, as a consultant, as a representative of the German legal tradition, and he would watch, with a mixture of a professional skepticism and a dawning and a grudging admiration. He saw the passion, he saw the prejudice, he saw the often chaotic and an inefficient and a deeply emotional nature of these proceedings. But he also saw a deep and a genuine and a profoundly moving commitment to the idea of a justice. He saw a Polish court grappling with the case of a man who was accused of having been a capo, a prisoner functionary in a concentration camp. He saw them listen to the testimony of the survivors, to the stories of a brutality and of a betrayal, but he also saw them listen to the testimony of the accused, to his story of a desperation, of a fear, of the terrible and the impossible choices that a man has to make in a world that has gone mad. And he saw them in the end render a verdict that was not a simple and a satisfying and a deeply emotional act of a revenge, but a complex and a nuanced and a deeply human attempt at a justice. And he saw a Jewish court grappling with the even more and a difficult and a painful problem of what to do with the Jewish collaborators, the members of the Judenrat, the Jewish councils that had been forced to administer the Nazi ghettos. He saw them, the survivors of the ultimate and the inhuman crime, struggling to create a new and a human and a Jewish form of a justice that was based not on the principle of an eye for an eye, but on the ancient and the difficult and the deeply Jewish principles of a repentance and a forgiveness and a communal and a healing. It was a process that was messy, that was imperfect, that was often frustratingly slow, but it was a process that was for Arthur a profound and a deeply and a personally transformative revelation. He had been a part of a system that had reduced the law to a simple and a brutal and a deeply inhuman instrument of a power. The law was the will of the Führer, and that was all. And here, in a refugee camp in the heart of a defeated Germany, he was witnessing the rebirth of a different and a more ancient and a more powerful idea of a law. It was the idea of a law as a process, as a conversation, as a communal and a struggle for a justice. It was the idea of a law that was not the instrument of a power, but the protector of the powerless. It was the idea of a law that was not the will of a single man, but the collective and the often and a difficult and a deeply human wisdom of a community. It was the idea of a democracy, and it was an idea that he was beginning to understand, a more powerful and a more resilient and a more enduring form of a social organization than the simple and the brutal and the ultimately self-destructive logic of the totalitarian state. The Americans had done what the Nazis never could. They had not just built a camp, they had planted a seed. They had planted the seed of a democracy, the seed of a civil society, the seed of a new and a more human and a more hopeful future. And they had planted that seed not in the fertile soil of a victory, but in the barren and the stony and the seemingly hopeless ground of a defeat. It was an act of a faith, an act of a hope, an act of a strange and a wonderful and a deeply American kind of a madness. And it was an act that would in time help to redeem not just the victims of the war, but its perpetrators as well.